Dr. Miller is a professor at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. She's received her master's degree and her PhD in immunology and her Doctor of Veterinary Medicine degree from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. She also received her master's in public health from the University of Florida at Gainesville. She's a diplomate of the European College of Zoological Medicine, and she did her postdoctoral training at San Diego Zoo. She then went on to work at several zoos in the United States, including the Los Angeles Zoo, Busch Gardens, Disney's Animal Kingdom, and Palm Beach Zoo. And she was also the veterinary manager at Disney's Animal Kingdom, so she's one of the veterinarians initially involved with creating Disney's Wild Animal Kingdom. She moved to South Africa in 2013 and is currently the NRF South African Research Chair in Animal Tuberculosis at Stellenbosch University, although she is based full-time in Kruger National Park. Michele is actively involved in wildlife research, particularly focusing on tuberculosis, immobilization physiology, and immunology. She's the past president of the American Association of Zoo Veterinarians, the current veterinary advisor for hippos, rhinos, and elephants for the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, and the chair of the Wildlife Tuberculosis Group in South Africa. She works with veterinarians all across the country and in the United States and private facilities around the world. Help me welcome Dr. Michele Miller.
Well, thank you, June, and thank you, Blank Park staff in particular, for the incredibly warm welcome. It's been an amazing trip, and I am very sorry that it's coming to an end. But I think this is going to be the highlight of my trip, is this evening, sharing some information with you. And I'm very, very excited. One of my big passions is rhinos. So we mentioned all things big and gray. And as you can see, June and I wore our matching rhino scarves for the occasion. So tonight I just want to share some information, and I know that this lecture series is about hope for the wild. And although some of the information I'm going to be giving you is a little bit, well, scary and depressing, I think that it can be inspiring as well. And that's what I hope you can walk away with this. And again, what the Blank Park Zoo is doing with the Black Rhino program, the messages and the awareness that they're creating in the community, and working with the university, and of course, zoos and professionals and the conservation community around the world. I want to applaud Blank Park Zoo and all the staff for everything they're doing and for you being part of it. So thank you. Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about rhino conservation, the past, present, and hopefully how we can affect the future. We often think about our interactions with wild animals as only going back, during our civilized times. But in fact, there's a lot of historical information that we were interacting with wild animals and impacting those populations as far back as 90 to 700,000 years ago, and actually hunting rhinos, prehistoric rhinos. In fact, there's evidence to show that the woolly rhino, which was found over the world and including North America, part of the reason that it went extinct was because of human hunting pressures, and that was 10,000 years ago. So, rhino conservation, and again, the threats that humans present to wildlife is not a new thing. There used to be quite a few different types of rhino prehistorically. There were 26 different genera, but through the various waves of extinction, those animals have become extinct, and now we're left with basically 5 surviving species of rhinos, which are distributed primarily in Africa and Asia. As recently as the 1900s, so just a little over 100 years ago, there were 500,000 rhinos that existed across Africa and Asia. So that's a pretty incredible number, thinking about that was only 100 years ago. And in a short 70 years, that number declined to 70,000. And again, that's of all of the 5 rhino species. And today, we are saying there's less than 29,000, but in fact, that number continues to decline on a daily basis. So it's probably less than that now. So where are these 5 species? What are they? Of course, the most critically endangered Our Asian rhinos, the Sumatran rhino, found primarily in Sumatra and Borneo. There's less than an estimated number of 100 left in the wild. The Javan rhino, I know this number is a little bit older, so there's probably less than 50 at this point in time. And fortunately, through conservation efforts, we do have about 3,000, 3,500 of our Indian rhinos found primarily in India and Nepal. And then of the African species, again, these numbers are a little bit older, but about 5,000 black rhinos. And we're saying about 20,000 white rhinos. It's probably closer to 15,000 now, again, as due to some of the declines that we're about to speak. So these rhino species are very different. They're found in different habitats, even though they may be in the same range. So for instance, our white rhinos, which are large animals, they can weigh up to 1,500 kilos, and they are primarily grazers. So oftentimes we find them in open savanna areas. They eat grass rather than browse, and they're not too fond of thick bush. The black rhino, which of course is what you have here, is about half the size of a white rhino, but I think their personality is about double. So they are feisty little animals, as you probably all know that from your animals. And yet this, I think, picture encapsulate that temperament, but they're absolutely amazing animals. They have a hooked lip, and that's for browsing. So they tend to be found in thicker bush and browsing on vegetation. The Indian rhino, again, is about the size of a white rhino. They're quite large. It's also known as the greater one-horned rhino for obvious reasons, or the plated or armored rhino because of the skin folds that makes it look like it's wearing armor. And then, of course, our Asian species that live in tropical rainforests, like the Sumatran rhino. This rhino is a little bit smaller than the black rhino, and it's red and furry. So you can get the sense of it's difficult to see, but they actually do have fur. And of course, at one point in time, we did have Sumatran rhinos in captivity in zoos in the US. Since that time, the remaining animals have gone back and are in sanctuaries in Sumatra, as well as wild populations. So they're wonderful little animals, but you can see they live in very dense habitat. And then the Javan rhino I've never actually seen because they're so incredibly rare. So I had to go on the web and get this picture. But you can see that, again, they look a little bit more like a prehistoric rhino, like the Sumatran rhino. So I'm going to primarily focus on rhino conservation in Africa because that's what I'm most familiar with. And black rhinos used to be widespread through sub-Saharan Africa. I know it's a little difficult to see, but this kind of area, this big swath here from below the Sahara down through East Africa and into Southern Africa, all used to be historical black rhino habitat. And as I mentioned, they used to be widespread, but they declined between the turn of the century and 1970 to be about 65,000. They were the most common African species of rhino, more than the white rhino. And so we consider them quite common at that point in time. We weren't too worried around 1970. But again, in less than 25 years, you can see the dramatic decline in numbers in the wild. It's just devastating. And when you're starting to get down around this type of number, you can see those animals are spread in very fragmented areas across their historical range. And so there may only be a few animals in each of these populations. So maintaining the genetic diversity and their viability as a reproducing population is now being threatened. Through conservation efforts, which I'll talk about now, their current population has gone up to about 5,000, which is a great effort, and it just shows that some of these populations can be pretty resilient if we just give them a chance. The white rhino, on the other hand, is an opposite story. We used to think of them as being quite rare. The southern white rhino are found in this small area. Of course, the northern white rhino used to be here. They're obviously now with the death of Sudan and just the existence of the 2 females, not considered to be a viable population, of course. So they're essentially extinct, and they are a subspecies of the white rhino. Back around the turn of the century, of the white rhinos, we had less than 50. So even a century ago, we were facing conservation threats to the existence of the species. And again, through some conservation successes that I'm going to speak about just now, that number has gone up. It was as high as about 20,000. We now think it's probably closer to about 15,000. And that's just in the last few years. So white rhinos are a wonderful conservation success story. And it's something that probably isn't all that well known, and it's why I thought it was important to share it with you this evening. Like I said, back around the turn of the century, there were only 20 individual white rhinos alive in one game park in South Africa, in the Shishlui-Amphalosi Game Reserve in the eastern part. And of course, that was at the brink of possibly going extinct forever. Fortunately, people were aware of the problems. There were some very dedicated conservationists, including Dr. Ian Player, who got involved as these numbers were kind of hovering around this, and they started to protect and conserve these animals in the Shishlui-Amphalosi. And by 1952, there were 300 white rhinos. Again, just because we paid attention and we started to protect them, that species could rebound. And because they continued to grow, in the early 1960s, they were starting to expand beyond what the capacity was at the park. So at that point, they launched Operation Rhino. They wanted to save the rhino. They wanted to make sure that this type of thing never happened again. And so what they did is they started moving these white rhinos all over South Africa. So we didn't have all our eggs in one basket. If there was either a natural or human-induced disaster for that one population, we were trying to spread that risk over a lot of different areas, and more than 600 animals were moved around South Africa, repopulating a lot of the areas where they historically were found. By 2000, more than 1,200 white rhinos were moved not only around Africa, Southern Africa, and East Africa, but actually to zoos around the world, in the United States, in Europe, in Asia. Again, the animals that you're seeing in zoos in this country are probably a result of the animals that were moved as part of Operation Rhino. So again, it's a huge success story because otherwise we may never have been able to see white rhinos. And in addition to that, we translocated over 400 black rhinos during that operation. So we thought, great, we've got all these populations and numbers are going up. We've learned a lot since that time. You can see it was quite a rugged and difficult operation, but it was a success. So it just teaches us a lesson. And because of that success story, the white rhino went from being critically endangered to threatened, okay? And it was taken off that endangered species list. Unfortunately, the opposite was happening with the black rhinos. Again, as I mentioned, the black rhinos were the most common species in Africa back around 1960, 1970. Unfortunately, their numbers declined, continue to decline, and they have rebounded a slight amount, as we've mentioned. In contrast, again, the white rhino numbers have been going up, and again, we felt at one point in the very recent past that we kind of got over the hurdle of losing these species. In fact, in the Shishlui-Amphalosi Park, it went up to and is currently at about 1,600 white rhinos and 400 black rhinos. And the size of the park is actually quite small. I mean, you can drive across it in a few hours. So it's not big, it's surrounded by communities and subsistent agriculture and those type of things. But because of that, it's actually currently the highest concentration of rhinos in the world. So they've been the kind of the Noah's Ark, so to speak, of rhinos, African rhino species. So moving to the Kruger National Park where I live, all of this green is South Africa. The Shishlui Umfolozi Game Reserve is right here in the very eastern part of the country, and the Kruger National Park is up here in the corner, and you can see it has a long boundary with Mozambique, a little boundary with Zimbabwe, and a very long boundary within South Africa. It's about 270 miles long, about 60 miles wide. So there's a lot of space, but the problem is, as you can see by the shape of this park, there's a lot of border. And along those borders, we have a lot of people. Just here in the southern part of the park on the boundary, we have communities that number in excess of 2 million people. So they need space, they need water, they need places to grow their crops. Oftentimes they have small groups of livestock. So all of that puts pressure on the park, okay? So even though this park was quite large and historically contained a lot of both black and white rhinos, by 1950, both the black and white rhinos were extinct in this park. And as you might be aware, it's an internationally renowned park right now for its rhinos. People come to Kruger National Park to see rhinos. And yet, back just over 70 years ago, we didn't have any rhinos in that park. So what happened? Again, in the early 1960s, as part of Operation Rhino, we started reintroducing white rhinos from Shishlui again into Kruger. And by about 1964, we had about 100 white rhinos that were moved. And from that population has grown because it's good, generally white rhino habitat. And it went up as high as about an estimated 12,000 animals. But now, again, we're facing a crisis with the population, and the numbers most recently have been estimated to be about 6,000. So we've lost half of those animals in probably the last 10 years. They also reintroduced black rhinos, which were previously there, again from Shishlui as well as Zimbabwe. And our current population is estimated to be about 400, which is great. They seem to be recovering a bit slower. There's not as much of the space that's ideal for the black rhino. So we felt pretty good about all this. The rhino numbers were going up. The park was successful in being able to maintain these animals in a wild state. However, there have, as I've mentioned, there have been waves of poaching or hunting or human interference that have affected the rhino numbers. So back in the early 2000s, you can see that, sure, there's some poaching that was occurring, but it's a few animals. It's roughly an average of maybe 10 animals a year. That's sustainable because we had, 9,000, 10,000 animals are reproducing. If you lose 10 animals to poaching every year, it doesn't have a significant impact on the population. However, as you can see, starting in about 2008, 10 years ago, the numbers jumped and they've continued to climb. And this is just in one park, one population of rhinos. We're losing over 800 animals a year. And on average, we lose 2 animals a day, every single day of the week, and some days more. So it's a really scary and depressing number. However, it's our call to action to try and save these animals. So why do those numbers go down? Okay, we know that habitat loss is part of that situation. We're losing land, as I said, as the human population grows and the demand for resources. Africa, historically, throughout time, has had political conflicts, and that leads to, again, lack of attention to some of the natural resources or even exploitation. And then, of course, poaching, as we're all aware. So habitat loss. As I mentioned, human settlement along the boundaries is encroaching on parks. Even though in southern Africa we have fence around our parks, people go into the parks and use resources. They snare animals for protein. They impact the river systems that is a water supply. We have lots of pollution problems and even toxins that can affect these animals. And with climate change, we're also seeing problems with drought, which is a natural risk for these animals because they just don't have the resources to survive. Again, agricultural production along those lines, and in particularly Asia, logging of the rainforests is probably the major factor that's caused the decline of the Sumatran rhino. Poaching right now is our primary concern. We've had waves of poaching throughout time, and certainly even just in this last century. Back in the 1970s and 80s, it was demand for ornamental dagger handles. Back in Yemen, when there was an oil boom and people had money, that they would want to buy some of these kind of exotic status symbols, so to speak. That seemed to have dropped off, but there's always been a very long-standing demand for rhino horn for traditional medicine in Asia. And so because of the cost involved in getting rhino horn, it usually was kind of at a low level, just brewing along, okay? So that has always been present, but it's been at a low level. But with the boom in, again, wealth in Asia, we've seen an increase in demand as people can use this. So rhino horn is used to treat fevers. It's used to treat cancer. It's to help with sexual potency. It's, you name it. People are using it for almost everything. And even though the scientific evidence shows that it has absolutely no effect, it's just like our fingernails. We could chew our fingernails instead. People continue to demand this. And then there's also a new demand. It's a status symbol, okay? So in the previous picture, you could see that this person is buying ground up horn. So a little bit for this person, a little bit for that person, probably, you know, again, might be sustainable. But when you have these kind of demands, now they give whole horns as part of a business deal. For weddings. It's a status thing. So the demand has gone up as the income and wealth of these countries goes up. And this is no longer sustainable. As I mentioned, we've had these waves of poaching, and Operation Rhino brought a lot of international attention to this, and there was a lot of pressure on many, especially developed countries, to put rhino horn trade in bans in place. So that was pretty effective, as we saw. We only had about 10 to 14 rhinos poached a year in South Africa right up until about 2005, 2007. And now we've got this surge. And what we've seen by tracing some of this, this material is that Vietnam is probably one of our largest consumers, the greatest demand, as well as China and Asia for rhino horn. So it's just, like I said, not sustainable, and the demand has just skyrocketed. In terms of the impact of poaching in South Africa, you can just look at the graph. There you go. We're losing about 1,200 rhinos a year in South Africa, which is the primary country that holds the remaining wild populations. And we're just kind of stabilizing this now. We're not really making an impact and making it decrease. And so we really need to be thinking about what are we doing and what can we do different to help save these animals. The other big problem we have in Africa is that there is consistently political instability in these countries. South Africa, not as much, but even recently we've had wars with Mozambique. We were involved in wars in Namibia and Angola. And during that time, it was well documented that the military would go ahead and they would shoot elephant, they would shoot rhino. That's how they funded the war. So, you know, there's not a lot of expendable capital. So during that time, not only did we have decreased protection because people were afraid for their lives, they're not going to be out in the field, it gave easy access for the poachers, but the real demand was for the military. And the government helped subsidize, again, their funding of these conflicts through this. This is one of the reasons that the northern white rhino became extinct. When it was in Sudan and DRC, there was a lot of political instability. There were wars. Numbers were coming down. Even as recently as 2004, we probably had about 40 to 45 northern white rhinos that existed. The country was under severe civil war. We tried to, through the Rhino African Specialist Group, to get those animals out of that country. The government refused, and during the war, they continued to poach them till they were extinct. And of course, the remaining white rhinos were in San Diego Zoo and in Czechoslovakia, and the animals that went to Kenya came from Czechoslovakia, including Sedan, his daughter, and his granddaughter. So that's all very depressing, but let me give you a little bit of good news and some hope. So what is being done? South Africa, as I mentioned, is a country where we have 93% of all of the white rhinos that exist in the world, and about 40% of the black rhinos. The black rhinos are also found primarily in Namibia, in Zimbabwe, and also in East Africa, so Tanzania and Kenya. So there are isolated populations. So the obvious thing is we need to protect these animals. We need to protect them now and allow them the opportunity to just reproduce and survive. So we have lots of increased protection that we'll talk about a little bit more detail, and of course law enforcement. So for those people that are poaching and doing criminal activities, we need to make sure that they get prosecuted and that we try to find out who are the people that are perpetuating all this. But we can't do these activities in isolation, okay? There's never one solution to a problem, is there? We need to take a multifactorial approach. So although this is obvious, we need to be thinking about what else can we do. And one of those is moving animals around. Just like Operation Rhino, where we spread our eggs into a lot of different baskets, we're trying to get animals out, translocate them to other areas where they're maybe at less risk or they can have increased protection. And of course, that makes it more difficult for the poachers than if there's a big population just sitting in Kruger. Captive breeding is so important. Again, that's the arc for us. Zoos, maintaining the genetic diversity, and also increasing awareness of the communities that live around those zoos, so that if, God forbid, our animals do become extinct in the wild, there may be a reservoir population that we can draw on to reintroduce into safe habitat in the future. Of course, we hope that that doesn't come to pass, but it's kind of our insurance policy. In addition, there's captive breeding in the range countries. So we can, again, get those animals into areas where they naturally existed and try and protect them and increase their numbers. Something that we often don't hear about, but is so important, we need that community involvement. So the people that are putting pressure on the park, that are poaching the rhinos, they're doing that because they need resources. They can't feed their families, okay? They have no access to some of the resources that are inside the park, running, water, clean water that's maybe coming through a river there that isn't existing on the outside. And then they've also been taking some interesting approaches, which I'll just mention. So increased protection. I'm sure you've seen some of the programs on Animal Planet and some of these other places talking about bringing in people to help with military training, because this is really a war now with the poachers and the rangers and the people that are protecting these animals. So getting the expertise of doing, working in the field and field combat, we get a lot of international support for people providing provisions for the rangers, again, including firearms at work that aren't rusty or jam or that don't have ammunition. And then we have been developing some response teams that know exactly how to handle these kind of situations, get in there, monitor the animals. In some cases, we even put radio collars or radio transmitters in them so that we can track them and keep a closer eye. As you can imagine, in a very large space, that can be quite difficult. So in that case, then we rely on aerial support. When something does happen, it's so important for us to figure out what happened and why, and then also be able to track the information. So we have, again, forensic services that know about rhino poaching. They can identify patterns of poachers in some cases, looking at the firearms and what type of bullet they use. We can, again, get a lot of information and start to try and intervene before we lose more rhinos. And we do a lot of forensic work using DNA from the animals. So if you can do DNA from a carcass and you can match it with a horn, you can then have a much stronger case when you go to court for that poacher. We're also using some high tech. They've created a rhino DNA index system called RhODIS at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And every animal, every rhino that gets handled has a special forensic kit where they take a little sample of skin from the ear, they'll take some shavings from the horn, they'll place microchips for identification in the horns and in the body of the animal. So again, if some of these horns are intercepted at an international airport, they can track those back to a particular crime scene. And again, you have to keep in mind that these poachers are not just local criminals, it's syndicated crime, it's organized crime. Wildlife trafficking is the 4th largest organized crime in the world. So we have some pretty sophisticated people that are trying to move these products. As I mentioned, Rhino Translocation. So it's great that we can track this, but how do we start to protect these animals and not allow them to be poached? So translocations or movements are key to keeping the population growing, all right? As animal populations grow, they start to run into problems, for instance, with territorial fights. So bulls are very territorial, and often they will fight even to the death. So every rhino that we lose is devastating for the population. So we need to avoid this, and we need to manage our populations by giving them more space and moving rhinos, especially bull rhinos, to different areas. We also sometimes need to move rhinos because we have drought or there's habitat loss. So we need to find them more space. That's easier said than done. So that's one of our key problems. And then occasionally these animals, because they don't have resources or they're being pushed out of their territory, move into human communities and cause conflict, either eating their crops or sometimes even causing injury or unfortunately death to people. So in those cases, the people aren't too sympathetic toward the rhino. So again, this is an important tool for saving these rhinos. How do we do it? The animals are darted from a helicopter. They're immobilized. You can see they're doing all the measurements, taking the samples, and then oftentimes we can hopefully load them into a crate and take them on the truck, much as like we saw back in Operation Rhino. But a lot of the animals live in pretty rugged terrain, as you can imagine. As they get pressurized, they're going to move away from people in areas where they're easily accessible. So there's areas where we can't get in. There's no roads. It's even difficult to walk through the bush. And what we do then, especially for the black rhinos, is we'll dart them, and then we have a ground team that's prepared, that has walked in, and they will stabilize that animal, get straps on its feet, and it's still asleep, it's still immobilized. And then we can use oftentimes military-grade helicopters and lift them and move them to an area. You can go up to about an hour, or even get them to a road where you can put them in a crate. So some of this technology is able to now translocate animals where we couldn't do that even a few years ago. The other thing is, I mentioned captive breeding in zoos. Well, we also have a unique situation in South Africa where you can privately own wildlife. And so there are people that own rhinos. And those people, when they're investing money in rhinos, they're going to protect those rhinos, okay? Because they're worth a lot of money. And so they put money into fencing, into protection. And there's one owner that has now captively bred his animals up to a population of about 1,500 white rhinos, which is amazing. So you can see it can be successful. And you can imagine the amount of money he spends on protection. The other thing that happens, and I know it's controversial, is that you can generate income by having rhinos by photographic safaris, ecotourism type things, but also there's a demand for trophy hunting, as we all know. And I know that's controversial. However, as I mentioned, you saw those bulls fighting in the previous slide. And some of those bulls have no place to go and would have to either be euthanized or killed by another animal. So in that case, both Namibia and South Africa will issue a limited number of permits for people to pay to trophy hunt these animals that otherwise might have to be euthanized, and that income can then go back into conservation and protecting these animals. So although I know it sounds horrible, it is one, again, tool that we can use. This, I think, is underrated and under-recognized, community engagement. By providing jobs to people, they become more invested. If there aren't rhinos, they're not going to have a job as a field ranger. So we need to get people engaged and find that there's benefit to conserving rhinos. And I think this has been quite a successful program, especially for the private reserves. A few alternative approaches that are, again, controversial. This is not a photoshopped rhino. This rhino actually had its horn painted with this fluorescent kind of neon paint. And there was a move a few years ago trying to explore all the possible options, thinking out of the box. How can we protect these rhinos and keep people from wanting their horn? And one thing that they did is they would try to drill into the horn and induce like a toxin or a poison, and then tell people, gosh, you know, this rhino with the painted horn has poison. If you use it, you know, you could die. You know, it's kind of a scare tactic. Well, that, you know, was a great idea, but unfortunately, when you started to look at that, it didn't really work. And so the poachers and the people that are buying this rhino horn, they're not dumb. They know how to do Google and get inside information. And so it's not really been implemented because they saw the reports that said this isn't working. So they just ignored the paint, and some of those animals were poached. But another technique is actually removing the horn. So as I mentioned, the horn is just like our fingernails, our hair, it's keratin. It's dead cells. So the rhino doesn't feel anything if you take its horn off at the appropriate place. And so, again, people have immobilized the animals. Back in Namibia, this is the first country to do this. It was controversial at the time, but it was actually quite successful in postponing the poaching that's only started to come back into that country in the last couple years. Zimbabwe did this back in the 1970s when they had very severe poaching, and found that many of the dehorned rhinos had a little bit higher chance of survival than the ones that weren't dehorned. And even in South Africa, we have some statistics. But the problem is now that the poachers are getting so desperate that they'll even take dehorned rhinos. And also because the poaching often occurs at night, they can't see if the rhino is dehorned or not. So we continue to lose dehorned rhinos despite this. Right now, rhino horn is going for about $60,000 US a kilogram. And in a white rhino, an adult white rhino, you could get probably between 7 and 9 kilograms of horn. So you can do the math. Although we feel that dehorning is a very useful tool, it's probably not a long-term tool. It's very expensive. The horn regrows, just like we have to cut our fingernails, and you have to repeat this about every 1.5 to 2 years. And the cost of dehorning a rhino includes the cost of helicopter, vet, drugs, ground team, etc. Runs about $620 to about $1,000 a rhino. So you can see it's quite a large investment, and you have to repeat that every 2 years for your rhino. So it adds up quickly. We haven't started dehorning rhinos in Kruger, and the reason is, although it's been proposed, is that a one-off dehorning event for all the rhinos in Kruger to protect them would cost somewhere between $6 and $9 million, and that would have to be repeated in about 2 years. And the resources are just not there, honestly. So other things that have been put in place and implemented, and we're again talking about, let's try and spread that risk out. So we're doing some regional translocations. There's a program called Rhinos Without Borders, and we're moving rhinos from South Africa into Botswana in the Okavango Delta, which is quite a remote place. It's very difficult for people to access. Usually you have to fly in. And so, you know, it's a little bit harder for people to get in and find the rhinos. And there aren't a lot there, so they're spread over a large area. The other thing is Botswana has very, very, very strict laws. And certainly if they have incursions by poachers, they have a shoot to kill policy. So that there's a lot more, I think, risk to the poachers going into that area. We're also trying to develop interest in other countries that might, again, take rhinos in large areas, breeding populations that could be, again, our ARC in the future. And Australia had planned to take about 80 rhinos from South Africa. Unfortunately, that plan has been put on hold because we've found tuberculosis in the Kruger National Park population. Australia has eliminated tuberculosis in livestock and wildlife there, and so they're very reluctant to take this risk of reintroducing that disease at this time. So we'll see in the future what we can do. Rhinos populations grow pretty slowly, about 3.5% a year. So this is just a chart from 2014 showing that over a 1-year period back in 2014, and the poaching has actually gone up since then. This is a yellow line where the poaching would balance the growth rate. And by the end of the year in Kruger, we were losing about 9% of our rhinos, so 3 times. We need a growth rate of about 3 times to sustain that population number. So now you can see why those numbers are going down. And so this is the bad news, and then hopefully we'll get to the hopeful part. The bad news is they've extrapolated what the poaching rate is. If it continues the way we're going, if we don't do anything, and the number of rhinos are decreasing, we believe that African rhinos, both the black and white rhinos, will be extinct in 2025. So in less than 10 years. So we're really, obviously, this is alarming. And once these animals are gone, there won't be any going back. So what can we do? Okay? We're all passionate about conservation, and we all can do our small part. And as you can see, even in the past, the lessons, if we give these animals a chance, those populations can come back. Right now, one of the things that's being done is they're creating rhino orphanages. And so when the mothers are poached, sometimes the babies are poached as well, but sometimes they're too small. They may be fairly newborn, and it's just not worth the risk of having a second gunshot that might alert the rangers. So everyone watches for this. They're constantly got aerial surveys going, and if you find a poached rhino with a calf, those calves will be rescued. They will be immobilized, either placed inside the helicopter or hung on underneath the helicopter like you saw earlier, brought to an area where we can triage them and then decide if they're old enough, we'll keep them in a safe kind of corral system and introduce them to surrogate moms. So if they can eat solids and they have the security of kind of a foster mom to show them the ropes. They settle right down, they start to eat, and they learn rhino behavior. For the very, very young rhinos, we have to move them to an area where they can receive more intensive care. You can see the bottle feeding and things that go on. And again, this is an expensive and really intensive area that we need to invest in because, again, hopefully these little guys will grow up and we can reintroduce them again into safe areas. Some animals don't actually die when they get poached. Oftentimes they will shoot them, they may injure them, but they don't kill them. So they can stun them. The poachers can actually take the horns off anyways. In some very awful cases, the poachers will use a machete to kind of immobilize the animal by hacking on the spine. And then that animal's still alive, they cut off the horn. If we find those animals that are alive, then we try to treat them. Again, sometimes their injuries are too severe and they're suffering. We do have to put them down. But there's a lot of novel approaches that we're using. Caps over the holes in the face, antibiotics, pain medication, really intensive therapy because, again, every rhino counts right now. But it's expensive, it's long-term care, and we don't really have all the resources we need to be doing this for every rhino, unfortunately. There have been a lot of great advances in technology. So through international funding, we've been able to get additional helicopters. We now have 4 helicopters in Kruger National Park. They fly around the clock, 24/7 patrolling. They have night vision goggles. They have infrared sensing. The pilots are specially trained right here in the United States. And we have rapid response teams. So you can see here's one of the rangers of the rapid response team with an anti-poaching dog. And again, those are specially trained dogs, usually come from Europe or the United States. And since the introduction of these dogs, the success rate of actually finding the poachers has gone up tremendously. So this has been a great technological advance. Again, increases in technology and knowledge helping us find poachers, getting the information that's going to make a difference when they go to court. Unfortunately, the reality of that situation is when we even when we catch poachers, this is the reality. We have a lot of corruption in Africa. People don't have resources. And so it's very easy for organized crime to bribe lawyers, to bribe judges. Some of these people just disappear. And so, again, it doesn't take much money in Africa. In cases in KwaZulu-Natal, which is where that Shishlui-Amphilosi Park is, out of 251 rhinos that were poached, there were 9 arrests and only 2 convictions. So those people that did this are back out on the street. And often these people, we actually know their names. We know what they look like, but they're protected. So we need to really address this situation, again, through resources. Sometimes we even have inside people, our rangers, some of our police officers that are involved in giving inside information. So we have some great investigative teams, crime teams, that are trying to address this situation. But it's a widespread problem that really hinders our success. And then there's some other controversial things that are being looked into. What about legalizing rhino horn? You can take the horn off the animal and keep it alive. So why not farm rhinos and sell the horns? Some of the private owners are actually stockpiling that horn, hoping that this comes about, and they will be very, very rich people. However, the worry is, if you start to legalize it, how do you make it accountable? How do you track it? How do you know which horns were legal and which ones were poached? So there's a lot of questions, and again, because of the corruption issue, people are very hesitant to go down this road right now. But it has been broached on certainly a national and an international level. So what can we do as people here in Iowa at the zoo? I think public awareness, social media, and activism has a lot more impact than you realize. People in South Africa know what people in the US are thinking. And if somebody is saying, well, we're not going to come to your safaris, or we're not going to support your business, or those kind of things because of involvement, it counts. And so in South Africa, there's a lot of activism. There's a lot of fundraising that goes on, which is fantastic. The next generation, they're the people that are going to save these animals. So making them aware, getting them activated and engaged is fantastic. And that's happening around the globe. Here in zoos, in the United States, in Europe, literally, like I said, all over the world. We also have our own little social media, and it's paying off, believe it or not. Everybody these days has cell phones when they travel. And we have, when you come to the park and you have a permit, you get a telephone number. If you see anything suspicious, call, text, let us know, take a picture. And believe it or not, they've been able to intercept people coming into the park before they get to the rhinos. This is working. This is citizen activism, which is fantastic. Again, education, making people aware, saying, we can't wait, we need to do something now. And we need to get people involved at the local level. And by doing things like creating opportunities for the community to be engaged in conservation. What does that mean? Again, people are looking at the parks or the private game reserves and saying, those animals have all the grazing for my cattle. They've got water, I have nothing, okay? I have to, travel with buckets and wheelbarrows to get water, and yet these animals are being protected. Well, many of the private game reserves have invested in the community, and it's paying off. They give them access to fresh water. They support mobile health clinics. They create schools in the local communities, and even having feeding programs for the kids. Now the community says, you know what? By having rhinos on the property next door, I'm getting some benefit. I'm getting a job, I'm getting health care, I'm getting water. My kids are going to school. And if the rhinos aren't there, they're not going to have any of this stuff. So it's paying off, but it is going to be a long-term process. Again, other things that we can do. We can do ecotourism. We can show our support by, again, going there, buying the local products it's employment, again, opportunities. So you have a benefit. And that is so important. You cannot believe the difference that we see in many of these communities. And then, of course, the most important thing is we have to engage the end users. This is the hard part, okay? There are a lot of people involved on the ground. There are a lot of global campaigns, sometimes even just creating awareness by buying stamps, making people aware. Okay, sometimes the guilt thing does work a little bit on certain people. Pulling at the heartstrings, this really gets to me. You see that mom is disappearing, and that calf doesn't have a chance. And you can see it's written in English, and it's also written in Vietnamese. And making people go, this is what you're doing when you use this. Think about it. Maybe there's other alternatives. And even getting people, most importantly, in the culture, on the ground, in these countries where the demand is, involved, using local celebrities, saying, you know what, this is not a good thing. I mean, we think back on the anti-smoking campaigns. It worked. It actually worked. So saying, you know what, this is not cool. We want to support this. We want to change in our culture. And again, reaching out to those people and putting some peer pressure. We know the younger generation has a lot of power. And so if we can get these people engaged and on the side of the rhinos, it will make a difference with time. We just need to buy that time. This is one of my favorites. This is a group of business people. It says, success comes from opportunities you create, not from a piece of horn. Boy, those kind of messages, we try to target at all the different levels. And I think that again, put some peer pressure. So hopefully what that means is we're going to see a lot more of this in the future and less of this. So that's where I live, and that's what I want to see and what I want to see for the generations to come. So thank you again so much for supporting the zoo, for supporting the conservation and caring about rhinos. Thanks.